I sat across from Elio in our favorite seafood restaurant, the one with the ocean view and the sound of waves always crashing in the background. 8 years of marriage, and there he was, introducing his pregnant secretary Genevieve like she was a new business acquisition. She had this little smirk on her face, one hand resting protectively on her swollen belly, while Elio announced they were having a baby together and wanted our house in the divorce. The audacity of them both made my blood freeze in my veins. Didn't expect it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Not the pregnancy announcement, not her smirk, not the way Elio reached across the table to take her hand so possessively. He'd always been ambitious, sure, but this was a new level of betrayal even for him. The evening light caught Genevieve's diamond bracelet as she sipped her sparkling water, acting like she hadn't just destroyed someone's marriage. Next, to her sat Elio, all polished in his tailored suit that I'd picked out and paid for last Christmas, his expression a mixture of defiance and guilt. The restaurant hummed around us, waiters gliding between tables, glasses clinking, laughter from nearby diners, all oblivious to the bomb that had just been dropped at our table. Genevieve kept touching her stomach, a theatrical reminder of what was supposedly growing inside her. Elio's baby, their future, the end of mine. "We think it's best to be honest about this," Elio said, his voice steady like he was presenting quarterly figures to the board. "Genevieve is 4 months along. We want to start our family in the house. It's perfect for raising children." Our house. The one I'd designed room by room, the one my grandmother's inheritance had paid for, the one I'd spent 3 years renovating. While Elio was working late, apparently with Genevieve bent over his desk, I looked at her more closely now, this woman who'd been my husband's assistant for 2 years. She wasn't extraordinary, just younger, her brown hair highlighted with expensive caramel streaks, her nails professionally manicured, her maternity dress probably purchased with the credit card I'd added Elio's name to. She met my gaze without flinching, that insufferable smirk still playing on her lips. "How convenient," I said, keeping my voice low, measured. "And you're certain the baby is Elio's?" Her smirk faltered for a split second, just a tiny crack in her composure, but I caught it. Elio stiffened beside her. "Of course it's mine," he snapped, defensive, too defensive. "We've been careful about documentation." Documentation. Like, this was another contract he was negotiating. I wondered what kind of documentation they had. A home pregnancy test? A doctor's visit? Certainly not a paternity test. Not yet, anyway. I picked up my wine glass, a 2015 Cabernet that cost more than Genevieve's shoes, and took a slow sip. The restaurant suddenly felt too warm, too crowded, but I refused to show a single crack in my composure. 8 years with Elio had taught me that showing weakness only invited predators. "I see," I said finally, setting my glass down carefully. "And you're telling me this now because we want to be fair," Genevieve interjected, her voice syrupy sweet. "Elio says you're reasonable. We want to avoid a messy divorce. If you'll agree to let us have the house, we can divide the other assets however you want." The house was worth $3.8 million in today's market. The other assets she so casually dismissed were worth perhaps half that. Everything else was in my name anyway. Not that they knew that. Elio nodded, leaning forward. "It's the sensible solution, Candace. You don't need all that space. We're going to need the rooms for the nursery and maybe more children later." I almost laughed at his presumption. More children. As if the one they were dangling in front of me was legitimate. As if their relationship would last long enough for more children. As if I would ever give them my house. Instead of laughing, I took another sip of wine and studied them both. Elio in his expensive suit, Genevieve, with her hand still protectively on her belly, both of them so certain they had me cornered. They thought I would crumble, scream, cry, beg, anything to give them the upper hand in what they assumed would be an emotional negotiation. They didn't know me as well as they thought. "When did it start?" I asked, more to observe their reactions than to actually learn the answer. Elio shifted uncomfortably. "Candace, does that really matter now?" "Humor me." Genevieve's smile tightened. "About a year and a half ago, it just happened. Just happened. Like a car accident or a summer storm. Not a series of deliberate choices, day after day for 18 months. I nodded slowly, absorbing this confirmation of what I'd already suspected. The late nights, the business trips that seemed unnecessary, the way he'd positioned his computer, screen away from me when I brought him coffee in his home office, and the baby is due August 15th, Genevieve said promptly, her hand making another circular motion on her stomach. I did the math quickly. 4 months along meant conception in December. The week Elio was supposedly at a finance conference in San Diego. The same week I'd tracked his phone to a hotel just 30 minutes from our house. The waiter approached, sensing the tension at our table, but professional enough to ignore it. "Would anyone care for dessert?" he asked, his voice deliberately cheerful. "No," I said, my eyes never leaving Elio's face. "Just the check, please." The waiter nodded and retreated. Across from me, Elio and Genevieve exchanged a look. Relief that this uncomfortable dinner was ending, certainty that they'd delivered their ultimatum successfully. I reached for my purse, a sleek leather Hermes that had been a gift to myself when I'd closed my first major client for the firm. Elio had complained about the extravagance at the time. Now I understood it wasn't the price tag that bothered him. It was my success. "I'll need time to think about all this," I said, my voice steady despite the rage simmering beneath my skin. "And to consult with my attorney." Elio frowned. "Don't make this difficult, Candace. We're trying to be adults about this." I almost smiled at that. Adults. As if sneaking around for 18 months and then ambushing your wife with your pregnant mistress at her favorite restaurant was the epitome of maturity. "I'm not making anything difficult," I replied, signing the check the waiter had discreetly placed on the table. "I'm simply being thorough. You taught me that, remember?" I stood up, smoothing my dress, a deep blue sheath that emphasized my figure, which was still trim at 36. Genevieve's eyes flicked over me, assessing, comparing. I let her look. She might have youth, but I had something far more valuable. "I'll be in touch," I said, leaving cash for the tip. "Enjoy your evening." I walked out without waiting for their response, my heels clicking against the hardwood floors, back straight, head high. Other diners glanced up as I passed, but I didn't see them. My mind was already racing ahead, calculating moves and counter-moves, assembling the pieces of a plan that had been forming since the first time I'd suspected Elio's infidelity. Outside, the ocean air was cool against my heated skin. I took a deep breath, letting it fill my lungs, steadying myself against the railing overlooking the beach. Behind me, I could feel their eyes watching through the restaurant's plate glass windows. I didn't turn around. Didn't need to. They thought. They'd won before the battle had even begun. Thought they'd blindsided me with their little announcement. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly know, was that I'd been preparing for this moment longer than they'd been having their affair, and I was just getting started. I drove home in silence, the coastal highway stretching dark and empty before me. No radio, no phone calls, just the purr of my Audi's engine and the steady rhythm of my thoughts. The dashboard clock read 9:47 p.m., not even 3 hours since Elio had texted asking me to meet him at Oceano's for an important discussion. Important discussion. That's what he'd called it. Like we were deciding on kitchen tile, not dismantling 8 years of marriage. I pulled into our circular driveway, the security lights illuminating the Mediterranean-style facade of the house that Genevieve now wanted for herself. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. 3 stories of custom stonework, arched windows, and wrought iron balconies perched on the cliffside with panoramic ocean views. I'd found the property, arranged the purchase, overseen every aspect of the renovation. Elio had merely nodded approval at my choices while working late with his secretary. Inside, I kicked off my heels and padded across the marble foyer to my home office. Not the mahogany-paneled room Elio used. My space, a light-filled corner. Sweet, I'd designed myself with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and a desk facing the ocean. I poured myself 2 fingers of Macallan, neat, and sank into my chair. Time to think. Time to plan. I opened my laptop and pulled up a folder labeled Beach House Renovations. Innocuous enough if Elio ever snooped, which he never did. Inside were documents that had nothing to do with tile samples or paint swatches. Bank statements, property deeds, offshore account numbers, and correspondence with my private investigator, Naomi. Naomi had been worth every penny of her considerable fee. Former FBI, now freelance, she'd been monitoring Elio's activities for the past 7 months. Not because I was a jealous wife, because I was a cautious businesswoman. When the first signs of Elio's infidelity appeared, I hadn't confronted him in tears. I'd started preparing. I sipped my whiskey and opened Naomi's most recent report, dated just 3 weeks ago. Photos of Elio and Genevieve entering a hotel. Financial records showing Elio had opened a separate checking account and was transferring small amounts, never enough to trigger any alerts, but steady. Most interesting, surveillance photos of Genevieve meeting with another man, multiple times, including during the period when she would have conceived. I pulled out my phone and texted Naomi. They made their move. Pregnancy announcement. Claiming. It's his. Need all materials ready by tomorrow. Her response came seconds later. Already compiling. Meet at 9 a.m.? Perfect, I replied, then set my phone down. I walked to the window, whiskey in hand, and stared out at the dark ocean. Moonlight silvered the waves, a steady rhythm against the cliffs below. 8 years ago, I'd been dazzled by Elio's charm. His cosmopolitan polish, so different from the steady Midwestern values I'd grown up with. 6 years ago, we'd moved to this house, and I'd believed we were building a life together. 3 years ago, I'd made partner at my law firm, specializing in high-net-worth divorce cases. The irony wasn't lost on me. 1 year ago, I'd found the first hotel receipt, and something had shifted inside me. Not pain, but clarity. I'd started moving assets, documenting everything, preparing for this inevitable moment with the calculated precision that had made me the youngest partner in my firm's history. Genevieve didn't know what she was walking into. Neither did Elio. My phone buzzed again. Cleo, my oldest friend and the managing partner at my firm. Are you okay? Did the meeting happen? I texted back. Yes, they want the house. She's pregnant. Allegedly his. 3 dots pulsed as she typed, then, those fuckers. What's your move? Meeting Naomi tomorrow. I'll stop by the office after. Need your eyes on something. I'll clear my schedule. And Candace? Destroy them. I smiled for the first time that evening. Cleo had been my roommate in law school, had held my hand through my father's funeral, had been my witness when Elio and I eloped to Santorini. She'd never liked him, never trusted his too-perfect charm. He's performing his life, not living. She'd said once, and I should have listened. I would listen now. My phone buzzed again, Elio this time. Coming home tonight? The question carried layers of meaning. Was I too emotional to face him? Would I be staying at a hotel to nurse my wounded pride? Was I making this difficult? I typed back a single word. Yes. Let him wonder what that meant. Let him spend the night puzzled, uncertain whether I was returning to pack my things or beg him to reconsider. The ambiguity would torture him more than any angry tirade. I finished my whiskey and headed upstairs to the master bedroom. Our bedroom, with the custom king bed I'd picked out, the fret linens I'd ordered, the view of the coastline I'd fallen in love with. I changed into silk pajamas, removed my makeup with practiced efficiency, and slipped between the sheets on my side of the bed. When Elio finally came home at 11:42 p.m., I was lying there, eyes closed, breathing the deep rhythm of sleep. I felt him pause in the doorway, watching me, heard his cautious steps across the carpet, sensed his confusion at finding me there, peaceful, unmoved by his bombshell announcement. He'd expected tears, screaming, a confrontation. Instead, he got silence, and silence unsettled Elio more than anything else. He slipped into the bathroom and I heard the shower running. When he finally came to bed, he stayed on his edge, careful not to cross the invisible boundary between us. I maintained my steady breathing, giving him nothing. In the darkness, I focused on the plan forming in my mind. Not revenge, that was too emotional, too messy. This was strategy, pure and surgical. Elio had taught me its importance during our early years together, when he was still mentoring me rather than undermining me. Never let them see your next move, he'd said once, explaining how he'd outmaneuvered a rival for a promotion. Keep your cards hidden until you're ready to win the whole game. I'd learned that lesson well. Too well for his own good. Morning came, and I was up before the alarm, dressed in a charcoal pencil skirt and cream silk blouse before Elio even stirred. When he finally opened his eyes, I was standing at the mirror, fastening diamond studs to my ears. A 5th anniversary gift from him, back when he still made an effort. "You're up early," he said, voice thick with sleep and wariness. "Meeting. With clients," I replied, my tone pleasant but distant. The kind of voice you'd use with a colleague you didn't particularly like but had to maintain professional relations with. He sat up, studying me. "About last night." "Not now, Elio." I cut him off smoothly. "I have a 9 o'clock. We can discuss it later." Before he could respond, I picked up my briefcase and walked out, leaving him sitting in bed, baffled by my composure. The small victory energized me as I drove to meet Naomi, the first step in taking back everything Elio and Genevieve thought they'd claimed. The glass-walled conference room at my law firm offered a panoramic view of the city skyline, but no one was admiring the vista. Across the polished mahogany table sat Elio, his posture rigid in his Italian suit, and Genevieve, wearing a cream maternity dress that strained to look professional. Beside me was Cleo, elegantly intimidating in her trademark black, a stack of folders arranged precisely before her. 3 days had passed since the restaurant ambush. Elio had expected me to crumble, to negotiate from a position of emotional weakness. Instead, I'd called a formal meeting at my firm, forcing him onto my terrain. "Thank you both for coming," I said, my voice cool and professional. I thought it would be more productive to discuss the situation in a structured environment. Elio shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting around the room that showcased my professional success. The walls displayed magazine covers featuring our firm's high-profile cases, including several where I'd represented the wives of wealthy executives like himself. I wondered if he was just now realizing his mistake. "This seems unnecessarily formal." "Candace," he said, attempting to reclaim control. "We could have discussed this at home. You forfeited that option when you brought Genevieve to dinner," I replied evenly. "Now we're doing this my way." Genevieve placed her hand on her stomach, that theatrical gesture again, and leaned forward. "We're just trying to be practical. A baby changes everything." "Indeed it does," I agreed, opening one of my folders. "Which is why I've prepared an initial proposal for the division of assets." I slid documents across the table. Cleo watched silently, her expression neutral, but her eyes missing nothing. We'd been preparing all morning, refining our approach, anticipating their reactions. Elio scanned the first page, his frown deepening. This can't be serious. You're offering me a buyout for my share of the house? The house needs to go to us. And the baby. The house, I said carefully, is not up for negotiation. It was purchased primarily with my inheritance and is titled largely in my name. But I'm willing to be generous about other assets. Genevieve's smirk, that same one from the restaurant, returned. Elio explained how California community property works. Nice try, but we'll get half regardless of whose name is on the deed. I allowed myself a small smile. Actually, if you'd done your research, or consulted a competent attorney, you'd know that inherited assets maintained separately aren't automatically subject to community property rules. Additionally, the house was purchased through my LLC, not personally. The smirk faltered. She hadn't done her homework. Neither had Elio, apparently, who was now flipping more urgently through the documents. This is ridiculous, he sputtered. You're acting like we have no claim. I'm being realistic, I interrupted. And practical, which is what you claimed. To want. The house remains mine. I'm offering a fair settlement on our joint investments and accounts. Given the circumstances, it's more than generous. Elio's face darkened. The circumstances? You mean my child? I met his gaze directly. About that, let's discuss the paternity question. Genevieve stiffened visibly. What are you implying? Instead of answering her, I removed a sealed envelope from my portfolio and placed it on the table. I'm not implying anything. I'm suggesting verification before major financial decisions are based on an unconfirmed claim. Elio stared at the envelope, then at me. You're requesting a paternity test? This is low, Candace, even for a divorce attorney. It's standard due diligence, Cleo interjected, speaking for the first time. You're asking my client to restructure significant assets based on your representation. Verification is prudent, not personal. It's incredibly personal, Genevieve snapped, her composure cracking. You're questioning my integrity. I kept my voice level. I'm questioning nothing. I'm verifying everything. There's a difference. The conference room fell silent except for the soft hum of the air conditioning. Outside, clouds drifted past the skyscrapers, casting moving shadows across the gleaming table between us. I waited, letting them feel the weight of the moment. Elio finally broke the silence. And if I refuse the test? Then we proceed to court, where a judge will likely order one anyway, given the timing and the significant assets involved. Your choice. He leaned back, attempting to project confidence. Fine. I have nothing to hide. I'll take the test. But this doesn't change our position on the house. Actually, I said, it might, especially when combined with other relevant factors. I nodded to Cleo, who slid another folder across the table. This one contained selected surveillance photos from Naomi's investigation. Nothing that revealed our full hand, just enough to establish that we had documentation of their affair. Elio's face paled as he saw the timestamp on a photo of him entering a hotel with Genevieve last November. Genevieve's hand moved from her stomach to her throat, a nervous gesture she probably wasn't even aware of. You had me followed? Elio's voice was low, dangerous. I had my suspicions investigated, I corrected. A wise precaution, as it turns. Out! This is invasion of privacy, Genevieve protested, her voice rising. You can't use this? In a divorce proceeding? Actually, we can. Cleo cut in smoothly. California may be a no-fault state, but conduct that deliberately diverts marital assets is still relevant. Which brings us to the next item. She opened another folder containing bank statements showing transfers from Elio's primary account, our joint account, to his private one, and then to a third account we'd traced to Genevieve. Would either of you care to explain these transfers? I asked. Elio's jaw tightened. I've done nothing illegal. Misappropriation of marital assets doesn't have to be illegal to be actionable in a divorce, I replied. But we can let a judge make that determination if you prefer. Genevieve looked at Elio, panic beginning to show in her eyes. This meeting wasn't going as they'd planned. They'd expected to find me emotional, desperate to save my marriage, or at least my dignity. Instead, they were facing a prepared adversary with evidence of their deception. "Why don't we take a brief recess?" Cleo suggested, her tone making it clear this wasn't a request. "Perhaps you'd like to confer privately." Without waiting for a response, she stood and gestured toward the door. Elio and Genevieve exchanged glances before rising stiffly and exiting to the small anteroom we'd arranged for them. When the door closed behind them, Cleo turned to me. "They're rattled, especially her. Did you see her face when you mentioned the paternity test?" I nodded. "She knows there's a risk it's not his, but she's committed to the lie now. Too much at stake to back down." "How much of our evidence are you planning to reveal today?" "Just enough to establish we're not bluffing," I said, rearranging papers in my folder. "I want them unbalanced but not desperate yet." Cleo smiled, the sharp, knowing smile that had intimidated opposing counsel for 15 years. "Perfect. And the Archer Holdings revelation? Saving that for court?" "For the right moment," I confirmed. "When it will do the most damage." We waited, reviewing our notes as the minutes ticked by. Through the glass walls, I could see Elio and Genevieve in heated discussion, his hands gesturing emphatically, her arms crossed defensively over her pregnant belly. Their united front was already showing cracks. When they returned, their expressions had hardened into forced composure. Elio spoke first, his businessman persona firmly in place. "We're willing to discuss a more equitable division of assets," he said, "but the house remains non-negotiable. Our child deserves the stability of that home." I met his gaze steadily. "Alleged child, and my final offer on the house stands. You can accept the buyout or face me in court, where I promise you'll receive considerably less." Genevieve leaned forward, her smirk replaced with a cold stare. "You won't win by being difficult, Candace. We know things about you, too. Things that wouldn't look good to a judge." The threat hung in the air, clumsy and desperate. I didn't blink, didn't even ask what things she was referring to. Her bluff was as transparent as her motives. "This meeting is concluded," I said, closing my folder. "You have my offer. I'll give you 48 hours to consider it before we file our petition." As they gathered their things, Elio paused, looking directly at me with something like confusion in his eyes. "I never thought you'd be this calculated. 8 years of marriage and he still didn't know me at all." "That's because you never paid attention, Elio," I replied quietly. "But I've always been paying attention." Always. Later that evening, I sat on the terrace of my beach house, watching waves crash against the cliffs below. The sun was setting, painting the sky in fiery oranges and deep purples. I cradled a glass of Pinot Noir, letting the ocean breeze cool my face after the intensity of the day's confrontation. My phone rang. Vince, my brother, calling from Chicago. I'd texted him a brief update after the meeting. "Hey, fighter," said when I answered. "How are you holding up?" I smiled at the nickname. Since we were kids, Vince had called me that. The scrappy little sister who never backed down from neighborhood bullies or academic challenges. "I'm okay," I said, surprising myself with how true it felt. "Better than I expected, actually." "Cleo said you were magnificent, ice cold and razor sharp." She exaggerates. "No, she doesn't. Not about courtroom performance." Vince paused. "Remember Dad's advice?" I closed my eyes, feeling the familiar pang whenever we mentioned our father. Arthur Morris, the straightforward Midwestern attorney who'd raised us with equal parts warmth and unwavering principles after our mother died. He'd passed away 2 months before my wedding to Elio, a wedding he'd had quiet reservations about. No, more, prepare harder, and never show your full hand at once, I quoted. Exactly. Dad would be proud of how you're handling this. Would he? I wondered. Or would he be disappointed that I'd ignored the subtle warnings he'd tried to give me about Elio? The gentle questions about Elio's family background, his career trajectory, his convenient explanations for why his parents couldn't attend our small wedding. You're thinking about what he said at the hospital, aren't you? Vince asked, always intuitive about my thoughts. I was. During those final days, when the cancer had taken most of his strength but none of his clarity, Dad had held my hand and said, "Be careful with this one, fighter. He looks at you like you're an achievement, not a partner." I'd dismissed it as the protective concerns of a dying father. Now I recognized it as the insight of a man who'd spent 40 years reading people's true intentions. I should have listened, I admitted. Maybe. But you wouldn't be who you are today if you had. There was truth to that. The 8 years with Elio had transformed me from an idealistic young attorney to a hardened strategist. I'd learned to navigate the waters of his subtle manipulations, to recognize the gap between his words and actions, to protect myself financially and emotionally without ever letting him see my shields. How did we get here, Vince? I asked, watching the last sliver of sun disappear beyond the horizon. 8 years ago, I thought we were building something real. 8 years ago, he thought he was marrying an up-and-coming attorney with good family connections, Vince replied. Not a force of nature who'd outshine him professionally and financially. His ego couldn't handle your success. I sipped my wine, considering this. When Elio and I first met at a charity gala, I'd been a third-year associate with Promise. He'd been the charming investment director 7 years my senior, worldly and established, offering me entry into circles I'd only glimpsed from afar. I remembered our first date, a symphony followed by dinner at an exclusive restaurant where he knew the chef personally. How sophisticated it had all seemed to a woman raised in suburban Illinois by a widowed public defender. How perfectly he'd played the role of enlightened mentor and passionate suitor. The signs were there from the beginning, I admitted. The way he'd correct my pronunciation of wine regions, the subtle digs whenever I achieved something at the firm, always positioning himself as the teacher, never the student. And the convenient distance from his own family, Vince added. The parents in Switzerland who could never visit. The sister perpetually traveling abroad. That had been one of Naomi's first revelations. Elio's family wasn't the wealthy European banking dynasty he'd described. His father had been a mid-level insurance manager in Sacramento, his mother a high school teacher. His sister wasn't jet-setting across Europe, but living modestly in Fresno. The Swiss boarding school education? 2 semesters abroad during college, expanded into a complete fabrication. Do you think he ever loved me? I asked, surprising myself with the question. It shouldn't matter now, but some part of me still wanted to know if anything had been real. Vince was quiet for a moment. I think he loved the idea of you. The brilliant, beautiful wife who elevated his status. I think he convinced himself that was the same as loving you. I nodded, though my brother couldn't see it. That fit the pattern. Elio's relationship with me had always been performative, curated for external consumption. The perfect husband in public, attentive and proud. The distant, critical partner in private, gradually undermining my confidence while leveraging my success. When did you first suspect the affair? Vince asked. I leaned back in my chair, recalling the moment clarity had begun to dawn. About 1.5 years ago, he started working late more often, but his billable hours weren't increasing. Small. Charges appeared on our credit card, gifts I never received, dinners at restaurants we hadn't visited together. And you didn't confront him. No, I said, remembering my calculated restraint. I started paying attention instead. Documenting. Patterns. Protecting assets. The most critical move had come 14 months ago, when I'd created Archer Holdings LLC, named after Dad's middle name, and strategically transferred ownership of the beach house to it. On paper, it appeared to be a routine asset protection measure, common among attorneys with high net worth clients who might bring malpractice suits. In reality, it was my insurance policy against exactly this scenario. "Remember when I asked you to serve as the manager of Archer Holdings?" I asked. "Of course. Best decision we ever made," Vince replied. Elio never even bothered to understand the structure, did he? No. He saw the trust documents, signed where his attorney told him to, and promptly forgot about it. Finance was his domain. Legal structures were mine. The perfect division of labor. I couldn't keep the irony from my voice. The beach house had been purchased through Archer Holdings using my inheritance money and structured in a way that would make it nearly impossible for Elio to claim in a divorce, especially given the meticulous documentation I'd maintained showing the separation of these funds from our marital assets. "And the offshore accounts?" Vince asked. "Cleo's handling those. 3-tier verification required, and Elio's name isn't on any of the paperwork." We fell silent for a moment, the weight of the past and present hanging between us across the phone line. My mind wandered to the small moments that had accumulated over the years. Elio's dismissive comments about my boring legal work, his insistence that I attend his corporate events while finding excuses to miss my firm's celebrations, his gradual withdrawal of emotional support as my professional star rose. "You know what the strangest part is?" I said finally. "I'm not even angry anymore. I'm just clear. Like I've been looking through a fogged window for years, and someone finally wiped it clean." "That's not strange," Vince replied softly. "That's healing beginning. Dad always said the opposite of love isn't hate, it's indifference." After we hung up, I remained on the terrace, watching stars emerge above the darkened ocean. The house around me, the house Genevieve thought she could claim through Elio, stood solid and immovable on its cliff, just as I intended to remain. Tomorrow would bring the next phase of my strategy. The paternity test demand was already creating friction between Elio and Genevieve. I'd seen it in their body language during the meeting. Naomi was completing her investigation into Genevieve's other relationship, the one she'd maintained concurrent with Elio. And Cleo was preparing the legal maneuvers that would gradually tighten the vise. But tonight, I allowed myself this moment of reflection. Not to mourn what I'd lost, a marriage built on performance and pretense, but to acknowledge what I'd found, my own strength, carefully cultivated beneath Elio's radar while he was distracted by Genevieve's flattery and his own ambition. He'd never suspected I could be this strategic, this prepared. That had always been his fatal flaw, underestimating women while believing himself the cleverest person in any room. Tomorrow would show him just how mistaken he'd been. The downtown medical building was sleek and anonymous, its tinted windows revealing nothing of the activities inside. I arrived 15 minutes early, as was my habit, and waited in the lobby. 10 minutes later, Elio appeared, his expression tightly controlled as he approached the reception desk. He hadn't seen me yet. I watched him sign in, noting the tension in his shoulders, the way he kept checking his phone. No Genevieve in sight. "Mr. Vasquez?" the receptionist called. "Dr. Khatri is ready for you." As Elio turned toward the hallway, he finally spotted me sitting in the corner. He froze momentarily, clearly unprepared for my presence. I rose smoothly and walked toward him. "I'm surprised to see you here," he said, voice low. "I'm a party to the paternity test," I replied calmly. "My attorneys advise that I witness the procedure to maintain chain of custody." His jaw tightened. "That's not necessary." "Perhaps not, but I'm here nonetheless." Before he could respond, a lab technician appeared and directed us to a private room. Dr. Khatri, a forensic genetics specialist recommended by Cleo, greeted us with professional detachment. "Mr. Vasquez, Mrs. Vasquez," she nodded to each of us. "I understand we're conducting a paternity verification today." "That's correct," I confirmed. The doctor gestured for Elio to take a seat. The process is straightforward. We'll collect a DNA sample via cheek swab. Once the alleged child is born, we'll collect a sample from the infant and compare the genetic markers. Elio sat rigidly in the chair. And the results? Will be provided simultaneously to both parties and their legal representatives, she assured him. As the technician prepared the collection kit, I noticed Elio checking his phone again, his frown deepening. I wondered if he was texting Genevieve, if she was panicking about this test and what it might reveal. The collection itself took less than a minute. A quick swab inside Elio's cheek, sealed in a tamper-evident container, labeled and signed for. Throughout the process, he avoided my gaze, focusing instead on a generic watercolor painting on the wall. When it was complete, Dr. Khatri provided us each with documentation of the collection. We'll maintain the sample securely until the comparison can be made after birth. Expect results approximately 2 weeks after the second sample is collected. Outside in the parking lot, Elio finally confronted me. Was it really necessary for you to be here in person? His voice had an edge I recognized, the tone he used when feeling cornered. Yes, I said simply. This is just a power play, Candace. We both know it. I regarded him coolly. No, Elio. This is due diligence. Something you taught me the importance of, if you recall. His eyes narrowed. And what exactly do you expect to prove with this test? I expect to establish facts. Whether the child is yours or not doesn't change my position on the house, but it might change yours, or Genevieve's. He stepped closer, lowering his voice, though no one was nearby. You think she's lying about the baby? I met his gaze steadily. I think verification is prudent before life-altering decisions are made. Flicker of doubt crossed his face, just a momentary crack in his certainty, but I caught it. He was considering the possibility for perhaps the first time. Genevieve wouldn't, he began. Wouldn't what? Lie to secure her future? Like someone who might claim a Swiss education he never had? Or parents in banking who were actually in insurance and teaching? The color drained from his face. You've been investigating me. I've been investigating everything, Elio. That's what good attorneys do. He stepped back, reassessing me as if seeing me clearly for the first time. This wasn't part of his script. The wronged wife was supposed to be emotional, reactive, easily manipulated. Instead, he was facing a strategist who had been 3 steps ahead of him for months. The 48 hours I gave you to consider my settlement offer expires tomorrow, I reminded him. I suggest you think carefully about your position. Without waiting for his response, I turned and walked to my car, feeling his eyes on me the entire way. As I drove away, I caught a glimpse of him in my rearview mirror, standing motionless in the parking lot, phone pressed to his ear. Phase 1, complete. At my office, Cleo was waiting with Naomi, both women reviewing documents spread across my conference table. They looked up when I entered, questions in their eyes. The sample's been collected, I confirmed. He's rattled. Naomi nodded, pushing a folder toward me. This should rattle him more. We identified Genevieve's other man. I opened the folder to find photographs and a detailed profile. Caleb Richardson, 32, personal trainer at the exclusive gym where both Genevieve and Elio held memberships. In the photos, Genevieve and Caleb were captured in various intimate moments over the past 8 months, including during the critical period when conception would have occurred. He has no idea she was seeing them both simultaneously, Naomi continued. Based on our surveillance, she was with Caleb at least twice a week, including overnight stays at his apartment. The timeline makes him a very possible father. What about Richardson himself? Does he know about the pregnancy? I asked. That's where it gets interesting, Naomi said, flipping to another section of the report. She told him she had a miscarriage 2 months ago. We have text exchanges confirming it. He was devastated. Apparently, he'd been excited about becoming a father. I absorbed this information slowly. Genevieve hadn't just been cheating with Elio, she'd been cheating on him. And she hadn't just lied about the paternity. She'd deliberately broken one man's heart while using the pregnancy to secure her future with another. She's made a serious miscalculation, Cleo observed, tapping her pen against the table. If Richardson learns she's still pregnant and claiming the child is Elio's, he might have something to say about it, I finished, especially if he was genuinely invested in becoming a father. The question is, Naomi said, do we approach Richardson? Directly or let Elio discover this on his own? I considered our options carefully. Direct intervention carried risks. Richardson might warn Genevieve, allowing her to construct a counter-narrative. But leaving it to chance meant potentially losing a valuable card in our hand. We don't approach him yet, I decided. But we make sure Elio learns about him before the settlement deadline tomorrow. An anonymous delivery of selected photos should accomplish that. Cleo nodded approvingly. Creating friction between them gives us leverage. If they're united, they're stronger. Divided, they'll make mistakes. What about Archer Holdings? Naomi asked. When do you reveal that particular bombshell? Not yet, I replied. The paternity question is our first move. If Elio starts doubting Genevieve, he may be more willing to accept my terms on the house without forcing us to reveal everything at once. The strategy was taking shape. Create doubt between Elio and Genevieve, apply pressure through the approaching deadline, and hold back our strongest evidence for when it would be most effective. The documentation proving the house belonged primarily to Archer Holdings, and that Archer Holdings was effectively mine, would be our checkmate move if needed. Have the selected photos delivered to Elio tonight, I instructed Naomi. Nothing that reveals how much we know, just enough to plant the seed of doubt about Genevieve's fidelity. As Naomi packed up her materials, Cleo gave me an appraising look. You're handling this remarkably well. Most clients in your position would be emotional wrecks by now. I smiled faintly. I did my emotional processing months ago, when I first confirmed the affair. Everything since then has been strategic. Still, she persisted, watching your marriage end isn't easy, regardless of how prepared you are. I gazed out the office window at the city lights beginning to twinkle in the early evening. What's ending isn't my marriage, Cleo. It's my illusion about what that marriage was. And illusions aren't worth fighting for. After they left, I remained at my desk, reviewing financial documents and preparing for tomorrow's deadline. My phone buzzed with a text from Elio. We need to talk, in person, tonight. I considered ignoring it, but strategic timing was everything. The photos would be delivered to his office within the hour. Better to let him stew overnight, let the doubt take root before our next conversation. I texted back. Not tonight. I'm preparing for court tomorrow, available for a call at 9 a.m. His response came quickly. This is important, Candace. So is my work, I replied. 9 a.m. I set my phone down and returned to my preparation. Whatever revelation or negotiation he was planning would have to wait until he'd had time to absorb the first piece of evidence against Genevieve. By morning, the united front they'd presented in our meeting would likely show significant cracks, and that was exactly what I needed for my next move. The beach house was silent when I returned home that night, filled only with the distant rhythm of waves against the cliffs and the occasional cry of a night bird. I kicked off my heels at the door, a small act of liberation after the day's careful performance. In the kitchen, I poured a glass of water and leaned against the marble counter, letting the cool stone ground me. The house was dark except for the soft landscape lighting filtering through the windows, casting long shadows across the Spanish tile floors. This space, my sanctuary, felt different now, charged with the energy of the battle being waged over. I moved through the dimly lit rooms, trailing my fingers along walls I'd selected, furniture I'd chosen, the life I'd built. In the East Wing, I passed Elio's home office, the door slightly ajar. I hadn't entered it since discovering the affair, maintaining that small boundary even as I methodically documented everything else. Tonight, I pushed the door open. The room was immaculate, as Elio always kept it. Desktop cleared except for his laptop, bookshelves arranged by subject and height, awards displayed with careful precision, a curated space designed to impress, just like the man himself. I sat in his leather chair, running my hands over the armrests where his had rested countless times. From this position, he'd made calls, closed deals, and undoubtedly communicated with Genevieve when I was elsewhere in the house. The thought didn't hurt as it once might have. Instead, it reinforced the rightness of my current path. My phone buzzed, a text from Naomi. Package delivered 30 minutes ago. Subject received it personally. I closed my eyes, picturing Elio opening the unmarked envelope, seeing the photos of Genevieve with Caleb, the timestamp showing dates that aligned with her pregnancy. Would he confront her tonight? Or would he stew in silence, re-examining every conversation, every assurance she'd given him? Either way, the seed was planted. I left his office and continued to my private study, the one room in the house that was entirely mine. Unlike Elio's performative space, mine was actually lived in. Books with broken spines piled on side tables, legal pads filled with notes, family photos including one of Dad and me at my law school graduation, his proud smile, now a treasured memory. I settled at my desk and opened my laptop, pulling up the secure folder where I kept my divorce strategy documents. The settlement offer I'd presented was calculated to seem reasonable while protecting what mattered most, the house and my controlling interest in Archer Holdings. Elio didn't yet know that Archer Holdings wasn't merely a legal entity that owned our house. It was the cornerstone of my personal wealth management strategy, containing not just this property but several others, plus investment accounts I'd built largely with my partnership distributions and inheritance. On paper, Elio had a minor interest in Archer, a deliberate decision I'd made years ago to prevent exactly the situation we now faced. His 5% stake was dwarfed by the 70% I controlled directly, and the 25% managed by Vince as trustee. More importantly, the operating agreement contained a morality clause, a detail buried in legal language Elio had signed without reading carefully, that would activate if a member engaged in conduct detrimental to the company's interests. Conduct. Like, for instance, documented infidelity with a company employee. Genevieve had been briefly contracted to help organize Archer's files last year, a strategic move on my part that Elio had barely noticed. That temporary employment established the necessary connection for the morality clause to apply. I hadn't revealed this card yet. It remained my nuclear option, held in reserve for when it would be most effective. Instead, I was allowing Elio to believe his most powerful leverage was the prospect of a messy public divorce that might damage my professional reputation. He hadn't yet realized that my career had advanced to the point where a personal scandal would barely register. If anything, demonstrating my strategic handling of my own divorce would likely attract more high-net-worth clients to my practice. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. Elio's name flashed on the screen. I let it go to voicemail, curious what urgency had prompted him to call after I'd already declined a meeting. The voicemail notification appeared moments later. I played it on speaker, filling my quiet study with his voice. "Candace, I need to speak with you tonight. It's about Genevieve." A pause, then his voice dropped lower. "I have questions, important ones. Call me back." The doubt had taken root, faster than I'd anticipated. Good. I didn't call back. Instead, I sent a brief text. "As I said, 9 a.m. We can discuss everything." Then, setting the phone aside, I returned to my preparation. Tomorrow's conversation would require perfect balance, enough pressure to leverage his new doubts about Genevieve, without revealing how much I already knew, or what evidence I still held in reserve. In the stillness of my study, surrounded by the artifacts of my true self, not the carefully maintained persona of Elio's perfect wife, I felt a profound sense of clarity. For years, I'd constructed protective barriers around my assets while maintaining the appearance of transparent partnership. Now those preparations were proving their worth. The irony wasn't lost on me. Elio had married me believing he was acquiring a valuable asset, only to discover I'd been the one safeguarding myself against him all along. Tomorrow would bring the next phase of our confrontation. Tonight, in solitude, I refined my strategy and prepared for battle. At precisely 9 a.m., my office phone rang. I let it ring twice before answering, keeping my voice professionally neutral. "Candace Morris, we need to meet in person." Elio's voice was tight, controlled, but with an underlying urgency I hadn't heard before. "Not over the phone." "I'm in. Depositions until noon," I replied, though my morning was actually clear. Making him wait was strategic. It would amplify whatever doubts the photographs had planted. "I can meet you at 1 o'clock at the Capitol Grill." "Noon," he countered, "at the house. This is private." I paused, considering. Meeting at the house gave him home field advantage, but it also presented opportunities. Fine, noon. When I arrived, Elio's car was already in the driveway. I entered using my key, noting with satisfaction that he hadn't changed the locks. A small but telling sign he wasn't completely confident in his position. I found him on the terrace, standing with his back to the door, hands gripping the railing, as he stared out at the ocean. He didn't turn when I stepped outside, though he must have heard me. "Beautiful day," I observed, keeping my tone casual. He turned then, and I was surprised by his appearance. Unshaven, shirt slightly wrinkled, dark circles under his eyes. Elio, who had once returned from a red-eye flight and still changed clothes, before an important meeting, looked disheveled. "Is it true?" he asked without preamble. "About Genevieve and this trainer?" I set my purse down on the table and regarded him steadily. "You tell me. You received some information, I gather." "Don't play games, Candace." His voice rose slightly. "Did you have her followed?" "I had several matters investigated as part of my due diligence." "What exactly did you receive?" He ran a hand through his hair, another uncharacteristic gesture, for a man usually so composed. "Photos, her with another man, dates that—" He stopped, jaw working. "Dates that coincide with when she would have gotten pregnant." I nodded slightly, neither confirming nor denying my involvement. "That does raise questions. Did you know? When you demanded the paternity test, did you already know she was seeing someone else?" I moved to the railing beside him, looking out at the view we'd once admired together. "What I knew or suspected isn't relevant, Elio. What matters is verification. If the child is yours, the test will confirm it. If not—" He turned to face me fully. "She swears it's mine. Says the other relationship was over before she got pregnant." "And you believe her?" His silence was answer enough. Doubt had firmly taken root. "Where is Genevieve now?" I asked. "At her apartment. We disagreed about how to handle this." I allowed myself a small smile. "I imagine she wasn't thrilled about you questioning the paternity." "She was furious," he admitted. "Said I was betraying her and the baby by even considering it might not be mine." Classic deflection, I observed. When confronted with evidence, attack the person asking questions rather than addressing the evidence itself. Elio's eyes narrowed. "You sound like you're analyzing a witness." "Force of habit," I replied smoothly. "Though the principle applies universally." He moved to the table and sat heavily in one of the terrace chairs. "This changes things." "Does it?" "The settlement offer I presented remains fair regardless of paternity." "The house is not negotiable," I interrupted firmly. "Whether the child Is yours or not, my position on the house remains unchanged. His expression hardened. You've been planning this for a while, haven't you? You weren't surprised by the affair, by Genevieve's pregnancy announcement. You were ready. I chose my next words carefully. I've been aware of certain inconsistencies in our marriage for some time. I took prudent measures to protect myself. Any good attorney would do the same. What else? His voice was quiet now, almost resigned. What else have you been preparing? That I don't know about? This was the opening I'd been waiting for, the moment to reveal just enough of my hidden advantage to shift the power dynamics decisively, without showing my full hand. Archer Holdings, I said simply. His brow furrowed in momentary confusion, then cleared as recognition dawned. The LLC that owns this house. What about it? I sat across from him, maintaining steady eye contact. You hold a 5% interest in Archer. I control 70%. The remaining 25% is managed by Vince as trustee. He stared at me, processing this information. That can't be right. When we set it up, you said it was just a liability protection measure. Equal ownership. I said it was for asset protection. And you signed the operating agreement without reading it carefully. Page 17, Section 4.3 outlines the ownership structure quite clearly. The color drained from his face as reality began to sink in. You can't do this. Community property laws don't apply to assets properly segregated before and during marriage. I finished for him. My inheritance funded the purchase of this house through Archer. The paper trail is impeccable. You've been playing me all this time, he said, anger finally breaking through his shock. No, Elio, I've been protecting myself. There's a difference. I leaned forward slightly. And there's more. Page 32, Section 7.8 contains a morality clause. Members who engage in conduct detrimental to the company's interests can be compelled to sell their interest back at a predetermined rate. What conduct? Documented infidelity with a company employee would qualify. His confusion returned. Genevieve never worked for Archer. She did, briefly. Last summer, organizing our corporate files. You signed the authorization for her temporary contract. Another document you apparently didn't read carefully. The realization hit him visibly. Not just that he could lose the house, but that he could lose his entire 5% stake in what he now understood was a substantial holding company. This is why you've been so calm, he said slowly. You already knew you had me cornered. I prefer to think of it as being prepared, I replied. My settlement offer stands until 5 p.m. today. It's generous, considering the circumstances. You receive fair value for your stake in our joint investments, plus a cash payment that would allow you to purchase a very nice home elsewhere. What you don't get is this house or any increased claim on Archer Holdings. I stood, picking up my purse. The choice is simple, Elio. Accept my offer and move forward with your life, with or without Genevieve, depending on what the paternity test reveals. Or fight me in court, where I'll be forced to present evidence. That would likely damage your professional reputation considerably more than mine. You think you've won, he said, his voice flat. I paused at the terrace door. This isn't about winning, it's about consequences. You made choices repeatedly for over a year. Now you're facing the results of those choices. As I walked through the house toward the front door, I heard him call after me. Candace, wait. I didn't turn back. The seed of doubt about Genevieve was now compounded by the revelation about Archer Holdings. The pressure would build over the coming hours as he contemplated his increasingly limited options. By 5 p.m., I expected his surrender. I'd barely returned to my office when Cleo appeared in my doorway, her expression a mixture of excitement and concern. Elio just called Arthur Walsh, she said without preamble. My stomach tightened slightly. Arthur Walsh was one of the city's most aggressive divorce Attorneys, known for scorched earth tactics and astronomical fees, that Elio had contacted him suggested he wasn't ready to surrender as easily as I'd anticipated. "How do you know?" I asked, gesturing for her to close the door. "Caleb Richardson called Naomi," Cleo explained, taking a seat across from me. "Genevieve reached out to him this morning, panicking about the photos. He was furious when he learned she'd lied about the miscarriage and is now claiming the baby is Elio's. Apparently, he's been monitoring her calls since then, using some app they'd previously installed on each other's phones. And he heard her conversation with Elio about Walsh? Yes. She convinced Elio that the only way to fight fire with fire was to hire the most ruthless attorney possible, regardless of cost. I processed this information carefully. She's desperate. The paternity question threatens everything she's been planning." "Exactly," Cleo agreed. "And Richardson wants to help us. He feels used, manipulated, wants to establish paternity himself." This was an unexpected development, a potential ally emerging from the very complication Genevieve had created. "What exactly is he offering?" "DNA evidence. He has a hairbrush of hers from when she stayed at his apartment, plus texts discussing their sexual relationship during the conception window. He's willing to submit his own DNA to establish paternity once the baby is born." I tapped my fingers. "On the desk, considering our options. Walsh will advise Elio to reject our settlement offer and prepare for court. That gives us approximately 3 hours before our deadline." "We need to bring in reinforcements," Cleo said firmly. "This was always a possibility." She was right. While I'd hoped Elio might accept defeat after learning about Archer Holdings, I'd prepared for escalation. Now it was time to activate the full extent of our strategy. "Call Vince and have him fly in immediately," I instructed. "As Archer's trustee, his physical presence adds weight to our position. Then contact Judge Winters. It's time to call in that favor." Cleo nodded, already making notes. "What about the Fisher documentation?" "Have it ready, but hold it in reserve. If Walsh pushes for financial discovery, we'll need to time its revelation perfectly." The Fisher documentation referred to our evidence that Elio had deliberately concealed assets during our marriage. Specifically, his involvement in a real estate venture called Fisher Properties that had never appeared on our joint tax returns. Naomi had discovered the connection 6 months ago, and we'd quietly gathered proof without alerting Elio. "And Richardson?" Cleo asked. "Set up a meeting, but not here. Use the conference room at the Stanley Hotel, neutral ground. I want to assess his reliability before we incorporate him fully into our strategy." As Cleo left to make arrangements, I called my brother. "It's happening," I said when Vince answered. "Elio's hired Arthur Walsh." Vince whistled low. "The nuclear option. You knew he might." "Yes, but I was hoping to avoid it. I need you here as soon as possible. There's a 3:15 flight from Chicago. Can you make it?" "Already packing," he assured me. "I'll be on it. Everything else ready on your end?" "Getting there. Cleo's contacting Judge Winters now." "Good. And Candace?" His voice softened slightly. "You've got this. Remember what Dad used to say? When they raise the stakes, raise them higher," I finished, smiling despite the tension. "I remember." After hanging up, I opened my safe and removed a sealed envelope I'd prepared months ago. My own nuclear option, to be deployed only if absolutely necessary. Inside was evidence not just of Elio's financial deceptions, but of ethical breaches at his investment firm that would destroy his professional reputation if made public. I'd discovered it accidentally while organizing tax documents last year. Irregularities in client billing that suggested systematic overcharging. Further investigation had revealed a pattern going back years. I'd documented everything meticulously, but kept it separate from our divorce strategy, hesitant to destroy his career even as I protected myself from his betrayal. Now, with Walsh entering the picture, all options needed to be on the table. My intercom buzzed. "Mr. Richardson is confirmed." "For 2 p.m. at the Stanley," my assistant announced, "and Ms. Davis says to tell you Winters is in." That was good news. Judge Marion Winters had been a mentor of mine early in my career, and while she would never compromise judicial ethics, she had the authority to expedite certain proceedings and ensure our case wouldn't be assigned to a judge sympathetic to Walsh's delaying tactics. At 1:30, I left for the Stanley Hotel, taking a circuitous route to ensure I wasn't followed. Walsh was known for hiring private investigators of his own, and I wouldn't put it past him to start surveillance immediately. Caleb Richardson was already waiting in the private conference room when I arrived, younger than I'd expected, athletic, but with an intelligent face and watchful eyes. He stood when I entered, extending his hand. "Mrs. Vasquez, thank you for meeting me." "Ms. Morris, professionally," I corrected gently, shaking his hand. "Please sit." He settled back into his chair, tension evident in his posture. "I want to apologize. I had no idea Genevieve was married when our relationship began. She told me she was divorced." "I'm not here for apologies, Mr. Richardson. I'm interested in establishing facts." He nodded, seemingly relieved by my businesslike approach. "The baby is mine. I'm certain of it. The timing aligns perfectly with a weekend we spent together in Carmel. Genevieve told me she'd stopped taking birth control because it was affecting her hormones." "And when did she tell you about the supposed miscarriage?" 2 months ago. She was crying, devastated. I comforted her, told her we could try again when she was ready." His expression hardened. "Then yesterday I saw her getting out of a car, clearly pregnant. When I confronted her, she claimed it was her sister I'd seen, but I know it was her." I took notes as he spoke, assessing not just his words, but his demeanor. He seemed genuinely hurt, angry at being deceived rather than being coached to damage Genevieve. "I understand you have texts documenting your relationship during the conception window?" He pulled out his phone. "Everything. I never deleted our messages. I can show you." "My investigator will review them," I said. "More importantly, are you willing to provide a DNA sample and potentially testify if this goes to court?" "Absolutely," he said without hesitation. "That's my child. I have rights, and I'm prepared to fight for them." I studied him for a moment longer, then made my decision. "Mr. Richardson, I believe we can help each other, but I need to be clear. This situation could become complicated and public. Are you prepared for that?" He met my gaze steadily. "Ms. Morris, Genevieve lied to me, lied about my child, and tried to use that child to secure herself a wealthy future. I'm not just prepared, I'm determined." I nodded, satisfied. "Then let's proceed." The law offices of Walsh & Partners occupied the entire 42nd floor of the city's second tallest building, a deliberate choice that forced visitors to look up at the imposing structure before entering, a psychological tactic consistent with Arthur Walsh's reputation. At precisely 10 a.m. the following morning, I stepped out of the elevator into the marble-floored reception area, Cleo and Vince flanking me like guards. The settlement deadline had come and gone with no response from Elio, confirming he'd chosen Walsh's combative approach over my structured resolution. Now we were walking into the lion's den at Walsh's invitation, a preliminary discussion that would undoubtedly be designed to intimidate. I was dressed for battle in a tailored charcoal suit, understated diamond studs in my ears, hair pulled back in a sleek chignon. Cleo wore her trademark black, while Vince, who had arrived late the previous night, projected confident authority in navy blue. We made a formidable trio, deliberately avoiding the flashier appearance Walsh typically favored with his custom Italian suits and French cuffs. The receptionist, a polished young woman with a practiced smile, greeted us. "Ms. Morris, Ms. Davis, Mr. Morris, Mr. Walsh is expecting you. This way, please." She led us down a corridor lined with abstract art pieces that had clearly been selected for their price tags rather than aesthetic value. Another Walsh intimidation tactic, showcasing the wealth of his practice and, by extension, the expense of opposing him. The conference room door opened to reveal Arthur Walsh himself, standing at the head of a massive table. He was shorter in person than he appeared in his carefully staged media photos, but his presence remained commanding, silver-haired, impeccably, dressed with the practiced smile of a great white shark. "Candace," he said, using my first name deliberately. "Thank you for coming. I've heard remarkable things about your work." I didn't correct his familiarity, recognizing it as another small power move. "Arthur, it's been a while." We had crossed paths at legal conferences, but never directly opposed each other in court, a fact we both knew might change soon. Behind Walsh stood Elio, wearing what I recognized as his board meeting expression, tight-lipped confidence designed to mask anxiety. To my surprise, Genevieve sat beside him, dressed conservatively in a navy maternity dress, her hand possessively on his arm. Their united front had apparently been reconstructed overnight. "Please, sit." Walsh gestured grandly to the chairs opposite, his position. As we settled, I noted the strategic arrangement. Walsh had positioned Elio and Genevieve slightly behind him and to his right, subtly establishing himself as the primary adversary, while using my husband and his pregnant mistress as emotional leverage. "I appreciate your agreeing to this meeting," Walsh began, his voice carrying the smooth cadence of a practiced orator. "I believe in exploring amicable solutions before positions become entrenched." The irony of this statement from a man whose career was built on contentious divorces wasn't lost on me, but I maintained a neutral expression. "I'm always open to reasonable discussion," I replied. Walsh smiled, the expression not reaching his eyes. "Excellent. Then let's address the elephant in the room, your positioning regarding the marital home. Elio has explained your creative interpretation of the property's ownership structure." "It's not an interpretation, Arthur. It's documented fact. Archer Holdings owns the property, and Archer's operating agreement clearly establishes the ownership, percentages, and conditions." Walsh waved his hand dismissively. "Corporate veils are pierced every day in family court, as you well know, particularly when they appear to have been created with the specific intent of shielding marital assets. Archer Holdings was established as a legitimate asset protection vehicle 4 years ago, well before any marital issues arose," Vince interjected smoothly. "As trustee, I can confirm that all filings and operations have been meticulously maintained." Walsh turned his attention to my brother, eyes narrowing slightly. "Mr. Morris, your role as trustee while also being the brother of one party presents obvious conflicts of interest." "Not according to California trust law," Vince replied calmly. "The statutory requirements for trustee independence specifically exempt family relationships when properly disclosed in the formation documents, which they were." This exchange was precisely why I'd wanted Vince physically present. His intimate knowledge of the trust structure allowed him to counter Walsh's legal challenges with confidence. Walsh shifted tactics, turning his attention to Cleo. "Ms. Davis, surely you recognize that the court will look unfavorably on such obvious attempts to circumvent community property principles." "What I recognize," Cleo responded coolly, "is that properly segregated separate property remains separate property under California law. The house was purchased with Ms. Morris's inherited funds, which were never commingled with marital assets. The paper trail is immaculate." Throughout this exchange, Elio remained silent, though I could see tension building in his jaw. Genevieve, however, leaned forward, her practiced composure slipping. "This isn't just about property law," she said, her hand moving to her stomach in that theatrical gesture I'd come to despise. "This is about a child's future, about family." I met her gaze directly. "A child whose paternity has yet to be established." Her eyes flashed with anger. "You're still pushing that angle? After everything Elio and I have built together?" "Evidence suggests there are legitimate questions," I replied evenly. "Questions that will be resolved by the pending paternity test." Walsh stepped in smoothly, placing a restraining hand on Genevieve's arm. The paternity matter will be addressed in due course. For now, let's focus on establishing temporary arrangements while these issues are resolved. He slid a document across the table, his counter-proposal to my settlement offer. I didn't reach for it immediately, letting the moment stretch. Before we discuss counteroffers, I said, I should inform you of a development. Mr. Caleb Richardson has come forward claiming paternity of Genevieve's child. He has provided substantial evidence of their relationship during the conception period and has volunteered his DNA for comparison testing. The effect was immediate. Genevieve's face drained of color, while Elio turned to her with barely contained fury. Walsh, ever the professional, maintained his composure, but I caught the momentary tightening of his grip on his pen. Unsubstantiated. Claims are easily made, Walsh replied after a beat. If this individual wishes to pursue a paternity action, he can file the appropriate paperwork. He already has, Cleo interjected, sliding a copy of Richardson's filing across the table. This morning, Judge Winters has been assigned to the case. Walsh's eyes narrowed at the mention of Judge Winters. He'd lost several high-profile cases in her courtroom, a fact well known in legal circles. This changes nothing about our position on the house, he said firmly. I smiled slightly. Perhaps not, but it does raise interesting questions about the foundation of your client's claims regarding family stability, doesn't it? The first confrontation was set. The pieces were in motion, and Walsh was beginning to realize he might have underestimated his opponent. The courtroom was hushed as Judge Winters surveyed the assembled parties over her reading glasses. After 2 weeks of legal maneuvering following our meeting in Walsh's office, we had arrived at the preliminary hearing that would set the tone for the entire divorce proceeding. Walsh had filed emergency motions seeking temporary possession of the beach house for Elio and Genevieve, citing the impending birth and need for stability. We had countered with our own filings revealing the Archer Holdings structure and requesting summary judgment on the property issue. Now we sat before Judge Winters, Walsh, Elio, and Genevieve on one side, Cleo, Vince, and I on the other. In the gallery behind us sat Caleb Richardson, his presence a silent reminder of the paternity question hanging over the proceedings. I've reviewed the filings from both parties, Judge Winters began, her voice carrying the measured cadence of 30 years on the bench. Before addressing the property matters, I'll first rule on Mr. Walsh's motion to exclude evidence related to Archer Holdings LLC on the grounds that it constitutes fraudulent conveyance of marital assets. Walsh straightened slightly, confidence evident in his posture. This was the cornerstone of his strategy. If he could convince the court that Archer had been created to shield marital assets, the entire structure would collapse. Motion denied, Judge Winters stated flatly. The confidence drained from Walsh's expression. The documentation provided by respondent clearly establishes that Archer Holdings was formed for legitimate asset protection purposes, funded primarily with separate property inherited funds, and maintained with proper corporate formalities throughout the marriage. Mr. Walsh, the court will not entertain further arguments on this matter unless you provide substantive evidence of commingling or corporate irregularities. I kept my expression neutral, though beneath the table, Cleo gave my knee a brief, affirming squeeze. Judge Winters continued, regarding temporary possession of the property at 7421 Cliffside Drive, the court finds that title is held by Archer Holdings LLC, in which respondent maintains controlling interest. Petitioner's request for temporary possession is therefore denied. Elio's face darkened as he leaned over to whisper urgently to Walsh, who silenced him with a sharp gesture. Furthermore, Judge Winters added, adjusting her glasses, given the pending paternity action filed by Mr. Richardson, this court is not persuaded by arguments regarding familial stability as justification for property allocation at this time. Genevieve's hand flew to her throat, the theatrical gesture now transformed into genuine distress. The carefully constructed narrative she'd created, the devoted mother-to-be seeking security for her child, was unraveling before her eyes. Judge Winters fixed her gaze on Walsh. "Counselor, your emergency motion for temporary support in the amount of $20,000 monthly is similarly denied. The court sees no evidence that petitioner lacks sufficient resources to maintain himself during these proceedings." Walsh attempted to interrupt. "Your Honor, if I may—" "You may not, Mr. Walsh," Judge Winters cut him off firmly. "I'm not finished. This court has concerns about the pattern of apparent attempts to leverage an unconfirmed pregnancy for financial gain. These tactics do not reflect well on your client's credibility." The shift in the courtroom was palpable. The power dynamic had reversed completely. Walsh, who had entered with the swagger of predatory confidence, now sat rigidly in his chair, options diminishing by the second. Elio stared straight ahead, his board meeting mask cracking to reveal the fury beneath. And Genevieve, her hand still at her throat, darted glances between Elio and Caleb Richardson in the gallery. The precariousness of her position suddenly, devastatingly clear. In one 15-minute ruling, the advantage had shifted decisively. The house was secure, the financial demands were rejected, and the pregnancy that was meant to be their strongest leverage had become their greatest vulnerability. The reversal was complete. The courthouse steps became an impromptu battleground as we exited the hearing. Walsh strode ahead, barking instructions into his phone while gesturing sharply for Elio and Genevieve to follow. Reporters who had somehow caught wind of the high-net-worth divorce case clustered at the edges of the plaza, held back by courthouse security, but watching the drama unfold with predatory interest. I maintained a measured pace, flanked by Cleo and Vince, my expression carefully neutral despite the decisive victory we had just secured. Professional composure was everything now, especially with those cameras capturing every reaction. As we reached the bottom of the steps, Genevieve suddenly broke away from Elio and Walsh, turning to confront me directly. Her face was flushed. With a combination of fury and fear, her pregnancy-swollen features contorted with emotion. "You think you've won?" she hissed, stepping close enough that I could smell her expensive perfume. "This isn't over, not even close." I regarded her calmly. "Ms. Parker, I suggest you rejoin your attorney. This isn't the venue for this conversation." "Don't tell me what to do," she snapped, loud enough that heads turned in our direction. "You've been planning this humiliation for months, sending investigators after me, building your little trap. Genevieve." Elio had noticed her absence and doubled back, grabbing her elbow with barely concealed anger. "Not here, not now." She yanked her arm away from him. "Don't touch me. This is your fault too. You promised me this would be simple, that she'd just roll over and give us what we wanted." The raw desperation in her voice created a momentary bubble of silence around us, the courthouse traffic seeming to pause as her words hung in the air. In that silence, I caught Caleb Richardson's gaze from where he stood nearby, watching the scene unfold with grim satisfaction. "Ms. Parker," I said quietly, "your quarrel isn't with me. It's with the choices you've made." "My choices?" She gave a bitter laugh. "What about yours? Playing the perfect wife while secretly getting ready to destroy him. At least I was honest about what I wanted." Elio's face darkened further. "Genevieve, enough. You're making a scene." "A scene?" Her voice rose higher. "You think I care about a scene after what just happened in there? We've lost everything." Walsh appeared then, moving with surprising speed for a man his age. "Both of you now," he commanded, physically inserting himself between Genevieve and me. "Car's waiting. We need to regroup." As he shepherded them away, I could hear their heated exchange continuing. Genevieve's accusations, Elio's terse responses, Walsh's attempts to impose order. The united front they'd presented in the courtroom was dissolving rapidly under the pressure of defeat. Cleo touched my arm lightly. "Car's here. Let's go." I nodded, turning away from the spectacle of my husband and his mistress imploding in public. As we walked toward the waiting town car, a reporter broke through the security line, thrusting a microphone in my direction. "Ms. Morris, how do you respond to allegations that you set a trap for your husband?" I paused briefly, considering whether to engage. Cleo gave me a warning look, but I had prepared for this possibility. "There was no trap," I replied, my voice calm and clear. "Only consequences." Without waiting for follow-up questions, I slid into the back seat of the car, Cleo and Vince following quickly. As we pulled away, I caught a final glimpse of Elio, watching our departure with a mixture of fury and dawning comprehension. The man who had believed himself clever enough to orchestrate my humiliation was only now truly understanding what he was up against. In the privacy of the car, Vince finally allowed himself a satisfied smile. "Dad would have been proud of you. In there. Perfect composure." "It's not over," I reminded him, though I permitted myself a small smile in return. "Walsh won't give up easily." "No," Cleo agreed, already checking messages on her phone. "But his position is considerably weaker now, and from the looks of that scene on the steps, his client's solidarity is fracturing quickly. The foundations of Elio and Genevieve's alliance were indeed crumbling, exactly as I had anticipated they would once pressure was applied. The cracks that had appeared during our first confrontation were now widening into chasms, driven by the twin wedges of legal defeat and paternity questions. The next phase would happen without any further action from me, the natural implosion of a relationship built on mutual opportunism rather than genuine connection. 3 days after the courthouse confrontation, my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. I answered cautiously, half expecting a reporter seeking comment on what the legal community was now calling the most lopsided divorce battle of the year. "Candace Morris." My voice was cool, professional. "Ms. Morris, this is Emma Westfield, Arthur Walsh's associate." The young woman's voice carried the careful neutrality of someone delivering a difficult message. "Mr. Walsh has asked me to inform you that he is no longer representing Elio Vasquez in your divorce proceedings." I allowed myself a moment to absorb this significant development. Walsh withdrawing from the case represented a seismic shift in the power dynamics. Top attorneys like him rarely abandoned lucrative clients unless they foresaw certain defeat or unmanageable complications. "I see," I replied simply. "And may I ask who will be representing Mr. Vasquez going forward?" "I believe Mr. Vasquez will be contacting you directly regarding that matter," Emma responded, her tone suggesting she knew more than she was authorized to share. "Mr. Walsh asked me to convey that he wishes you well and hopes for an expeditious resolution." Translation: Walsh was cutting his losses and distancing himself from what he now recognized as a losing battle. The legendary attorney didn't want a high-profile defeat on his record. "Please thank Mr. Walsh for his professionalism," I said, maintaining the courteous fiction that this was a routine transition rather than a strategic retreat. After ending the call, I immediately contacted Cleo, who responded with a triumphant laugh. "Walsh bailed. That's faster than even I expected. Something must have happened beyond the courtroom setback." "Find out what," I instructed. "This changes our timeline." Less than an hour later, Elio himself called. I let it ring 3 times before answering, deliberately projecting calm despite the quickening of my pulse. "Hello, Elio." "We need to talk," he said without preamble, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "In person, not with lawyers." I considered the request carefully. Meeting without counsel present carried risks, but it also presented opportunities to resolve matters more efficiently and to witness firsthand whatever had prompted Walsh's withdrawal. "Fine. The Capitol Grill, 2 hours from now." "Not a public restaurant," he countered. "The house. Our house." I corrected him automatically. "My house. And no, I prefer neutral territory. The conference room at the Stanley Hotel, 3 o'clock. He hesitated, then acquiesced. Fine. 3 o'clock. When I arrived at the hotel's executive level, Elio was already waiting in the reserved conference room. The change in him was immediately apparent. His customary polish had given way to a man who looked like he hadn't slept properly in days. His designer suit hung slightly looser on his frame, and the shadows beneath his eyes spoke of sustained stress. "Thank you for coming," he said, as I took a seat across from him. "You wanted to talk. I'm listening." He rubbed his hand across his face, a gesture of fatigue I'd rarely seen from him. "I'm prepared to accept your original settlement offer. The house remains yours. I'll take the buyout for my interest in joint investments." I kept my expression neutral, despite my surprise at this complete capitulation. What prompted this change of heart? Last I saw, you and Walsh were determined to fight for half of everything. "Genevieve lied to me," he said bluntly. "About everything. The baby. It's not mine." The admission hung in the air between us. I waited, sensing there was more. "She confessed after the hearing. Said she'd been seeing Richardson continuously throughout our relationship. Said she targeted me because of my financial position." He gave a bitter laugh. "Apparently, I was the better prospect for long-term security." "I see." I kept my voice even, though part of me wanted to ask if he appreciated the irony of being used in precisely the way he had used me. "I just want this over," he continued. "No more court, no more lawyers, no more public spectacle. I'll sign whatever you want." I studied him, noting the defeat in his posture, the resignation in his eyes. This was the man who had once commanded rooms with his confidence, who had planned my humiliation over brunch with his pregnant mistress. Now he sat before me, broken by the very scheme he had engineered. "I'll have Cleo draw up the final papers," I said, rising from my seat. "We can complete this by the end of the week." As I gathered my purse, he looked up at me, a question in his eyes. "How long have you known? About Genevieve and Richardson?" I paused, considering my answer carefully. Long enough to be prepared. It was the only explanation he would get, the only one he deserved. The signed divorce papers sat on my desk, the final period at the end of an 8-year sentence I hadn't realized I was serving. Elio's signature looked different somehow. Smaller, less assertive than the bold strokes he'd once used to sign business deals and anniversary cards. The dissolution was complete, finalized with remarkable speed once he'd surrendered his claims and accepted my terms. I hadn't felt triumph when he signed, just a quiet sense of completion. There was no victory lap, no celebration, only the gentle closing of a door that had been ajar too long. Outside my office window, the city continued its endless rhythm, oblivious to the personal earthquakes that shook individual lives. 3 weeks had passed since the courthouse confrontation, yet it felt both like yesterday and a lifetime ago. Time had taken on a strange elasticity since then, stretching and compressing according to rules I couldn't quite grasp. A knock at my door pulled me from my thoughts. Cleo entered without waiting for a response, a habit born from years of friendship that preceded our professional relationship. "It's official," she said, dropping into the chair across from me. "Genevieve moved out of Elio's condo yesterday. According to Naomi's sources, she's temporarily living with her sister while she negotiates child support with Richardson." I nodded, absorbing this information without particular emotion. "And Elio?" "Accepted the position in Chicago. He leaves next week." Cleo studied me carefully. "How do you feel about that?" It was a good question. One I'd been asking myself since learning Elio had taken a job across the country, as far from our shared history as geography would allow. Did I feel vindicated? Relieved? Some lingering attachment that his departure would finally sever? "I feel nothing," I admitted, surprising myself with the truth of it. Not happiness, not sadness, just clarity. Cleo nodded as if she'd expected this answer. That's healing. Real healing, not the Instagram version. I smiled slightly at her characteristic bluntness. No inspirational quotes about rising from ashes? Please, she scoffed. You didn't rise from ashes. You navigated a storm you saw coming from miles away and emerged completely dry while everyone else drowned. The metaphor was apt enough to draw a genuine laugh from me, perhaps my first since this ordeal began. It felt strange, unfamiliar, as if my face had forgotten the proper configuration. For honest amusement. What now? Cleo asked after my laughter subsided. The house is secured, the divorce is final, Elio is leaving town. What does Candace Morris do next? I turned to look out the window again, considering the question. For so long my focus had been singular: protect myself, secure what was mine, navigate the end of my marriage with strategic precision. I hadn't allowed myself to think beyond that immediate horizon. I don't know, I admitted. And that's okay, I think, not knowing. Cleo raised an eyebrow. The Candace Morris I know always has a plan. Maybe this Candace Morris needs to learn how to live without one for a while. My phone buzzed with a text from Vince. Dad's fishing cabin is still available if you need space to decompress. Keys where they always were. Our father's small cabin in the mountains. A simple, rustic retreat where he'd taken us fishing as children, where he'd taught us patience and perspective alongside how to bait hooks and clean catches. I hadn't been there since before his death, avoiding the memories it held. Now, suddenly, it seemed like exactly what I needed. Actually, I said, showing Cleo the message, I think I do have a plan. At least for the next week or two. She read the text and smiled. Perfect. The firm will survive without you for a while. As Cleo left, I ran my fingers lightly over the signed divorce papers one last time. There was paperwork to file, final notifications to send, practical matters to address. But those could wait a few days. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I had no strategic objective to pursue, no adversary to outmaneuver, no position to defend. I had only myself, and the unfamiliar freedom to decide what came next. That evening, I packed a small bag with casual clothes, books I'd been meaning to read for years, and simple necessities. No tailored suits, no case files, no legal briefs. As I locked the beach house, my house, indisputably now, I paused to watch the sunset cast golden light across the ocean. The view was unchanged, but my perspective had shifted. Tomorrow, I would drive to the mountains, to my father's cabin, to quiet and simplicity. Not to hide, but to reacquaint myself with the woman I was beyond strategies and defenses. The woman who had survived and won, but needed now to remember who she was beneath the armor. 6 months later, I stood in the great room of the beach house, surveying the transformation. Gone were Elio's carefully curated art pieces, and the formal furniture he'd insisted matched his vision of executive success. In their place, comfortable, seating arranged to showcase the ocean view, bookshelves filled with volumes I actually intended to read, and artwork that spoke to me rather than to visitors' expectations. Cleo whistled appreciatively as she carried in a bottle of champagne and 2 glasses. Now it finally looks like your place. That's the idea, I replied, accepting a glass. No more compromises. We stepped out onto the terrace, where the October breeze carried the salt tang of the ocean below. The house had undergone more than aesthetic changes during the past months. I'd had the security system completely overhauled, the master bathroom redesigned to my preferences, and most symbolically, the master bedroom relocated to what had been a rarely used guest suite with the best ocean view. The old bedroom, the one I'd shared with Elio, was now my home office. To new beginnings, Cleo offered, raising her glass. I clinked mine against hers. And clear endings. The divorce aftermath had unfolded with surprising speed once the initial conflict was resolved. Elio had departed for Chicago without a backward glance, apparently eager to escape the professional whispers that had followed our high-profile separation. According to Vince, who maintained connections in financial circles, Elio was rebuilding his career there with moderate success, though not at the prestigious level he'd once enjoyed. Genevieve's story had taken a more unexpected turn. After DNA testing confirmed Caleb Richardson as the father of her child, she'd initially pursued aggressive child support demands based on his family's modest wealth. Then, in a twist that had surprised everyone, they had reconciled. Naomi's sources reported they were now cautiously building a life together, with Richardson fully embracing fatherhood when their daughter was born 3 months ago. I felt no animosity toward either of them anymore, just a distant recognition of the roles they'd played in my story before exiting the stage. "Have you heard from Elio at all?" Cleo asked, settling into one of the new lounge chairs. "Not directly," I replied. "His attorney contacted mine about some final tax matters last month, but otherwise silence." "Good riddance," she declared with characteristic bluntness. I smiled, finding I agreed completely. The 2 months I'd spent at my father's cabin after the divorce had provided unexpected clarity. In that simple space, surrounded by nature and the echoes of childhood memories, I'd gradually reconnected with parts of myself that had been suppressed during my marriage. My appreciation for simplicity, my love of reading for pleasure rather than advantage, my ability to find contentment in solitude. "The firm misses you, you know," Cleo said, changing the subject. "Taking only select cases has everyone wondering when the full Candace Morris will return." After returning from the cabin, I'd made the deliberate choice to scale back my practice, selecting only cases that truly interested me rather than pursuing the relentless advancement that had defined my earlier career. The decision had raised eyebrows at the firm, but my partnership agreement gave me the latitude to make this choice. "I'm exactly where I want to be professionally," I assured her. "Quality over quantity." And it was true. My reduced caseload had allowed me to focus more deeply on each client, to mentor younger attorneys, and most importantly, to reclaim time for myself, time that was now mine alone to allocate. "Speaking of quality," Cleo said, reaching for her phone, "Vince sent me a listing you should see. That property adjacent to your father's cabin, it's coming on the market next month." I took the phone, examining the photographs of the small lakefront lot neighboring my father's mountain retreat. During my stay there, I'd often walked past it, admiring its position and the way the afternoon light filtered through the pines. "Are you thinking what I think you're thinking?" Cleo asked, watching my expression. "Maybe," I admitted. A second. Home, completely different from this one. Somewhere with no memories, no history, just possibilities. It wasn't an escape plan or a strategic move. It was simply a choice, one made from desire rather than necessity, from forward momentum rather than reaction. The woman who had entered that seafood restaurant 8 months ago to face her husband and his pregnant mistress wouldn't have recognized this version of herself, not in her newfound comfort with uncertainty, not in her willingness to pursue satisfaction over status, not in her ability to view the beach house as truly hers alone. That transformation, more than the legal victory or financial security, was the true resolution of the conflict Elio and Genevieve had unknowingly initiated. 2 years to the day after Elio and Genevieve had ambushed me with their pregnancy announcement, I stood on the dock of my newly completed mountain cabin, watching morning mist rise from the lake surface. The adjacent property to my father's original cabin had indeed become mine, and over the past year, I'd built a simple, elegant retreat that complemented rather than overshadowed the landscape. The contrast between my two homes couldn't have been more striking. The beach house with its panoramic ocean views and refined luxury, this woodland sanctuary with its rustic warmth and profound quiet. Together, they represented the different facets of myself I'd reclaimed and nurtured since the divorce. My phone vibrated in my pocket, a text from Vince. Happy Independence Day, unofficial family holiday. Dad would be proud. I smiled at my brother's commemoration of what had become a private celebration between us, marking not the painful end of my marriage, but the beginning of my authentic life. The reference to our father brought a bittersweet warmth. Arthur Morris hadn't lived to see his warning about Elio proven right, but his wisdom had helped me navigate the aftermath with dignity and strategic clarity. The morning air was cool against my skin as I sipped coffee from a handmade ceramic mug purchased from a local artist. In the distance, a loon called across the water, its haunting voice echoing against the surrounding mountains. This moment, simple, peaceful, entirely mine, felt like the culmination of a journey I hadn't known I was undertaking when I walked into that seafood restaurant 2 years ago. I'd received a wedding invitation last month. Caleb Richardson and Genevieve Parker were formalizing their reconciliation, creating a legal family unit with their daughter, now a toddler. The invitation had surprised me, but I understood the gesture for what it was: acknowledgement of the strange intersection of our lives, and perhaps Genevieve's attempt at amends. I hadn't decided yet whether to attend, but the invitation no longer carried emotional weight, just an interesting footnote in a chapter already completed. Elio remained in Chicago, occasionally appearing in financial news for moderate professional achievements. According to mutual acquaintances, he had recently begun dating someone new, a corporate attorney, ironically enough. I wished them well with genuine indifference. Setting my coffee down, I pulled out the notebook I'd begun keeping during those first reflective weeks at my father's cabin. Its pages charted my evolution from strategic survivor to deliberate creator of my own life. The most recent entry, written last night, contained a quote from my father I'd suddenly remembered while falling asleep. "The best revenge isn't just living well, fighter. It's living authentically. Everything else is just noise." Looking out, over the misty lake, I realized the true victory wasn't that I owned the mansion they had wanted. It was that I finally, completely owned myself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.